Things are tightening on loot boxes across the world in today's story that is also going to educate us and enlighten us on why Ted Cruz, he doesn't like it, but he will do it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely.
He is quite the modern gamer, as it turns out. So we've seen legislators, etc., across the world actually talk about loot boxes, kind of gambling mechanics indeed, in video games. And we have some fairly major updates, in this case from Spain and the Netherlands, as well as some other things from the UK and the US. So It's quite the episode we got for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of this, you may have seen our last video, which was the tightening again of this, coming from the Norwegian report. That was basically we considered it really, really good because it nailed all the stuff. A lot of the reports in the UK, the reports that are kind of the ones that anyone can read and go, okay, we actually understand from the government perspective what this is going to be. And a lot of them before were just, loot boxes, are they gambling? And the answer is, they're gambling, but value's a bit weird, so we can't really call them gambling.
Yeah.
So we can't use gambling legislation to kill it. We have to make new legislation. But the Norwegian report was very much, we're not talking about gambling. We are, but we're also discussing how all of these things are bad in general. And that's pushed forward a little bit now. So we now see some more movement of people going, these may not be gambling, but they are a problem. They are going to cause damage to the economic and personal lives of people, so we need to do something.
That's it. We use the legacy framework to try to understand the issue in the first instance, and now we're actually more developing things specifically tailored to what this is. Mm-hmm. So we'll kick it off with Spain. Right? So Spain are jumping in there. The Spanish Ministry of Consumer Affairs has submitted some legislation for public consultation. So I suppose if you're in Spain, get on that, however that happens. That covers not just loot boxes in games, but basically all the surrounding info on them, as well as other things like NFTs, actually. And this does actually make Spain the first country in Europe to specifically prepare some legislation to this effect without basically having to do the whole big song and dance as to whether they legally define something as gambling or not. Yeah. Basically, it's shagged a lot of that. Let's actually deal with this problem right now. Okay, so the legislation refers to all of this as random reward mechanisms. Of course, worth saying, specifically in the instance where they are monetized. Right? I don't think anybody has a problem with you crack open a rock in No Man's Sky, it has a geode, you hit the open button, you get something random out of it. That's not the issue. It's the FIFA Ultimate Team. It's all of those things. And there's this just very striking, strong quote from the legislation that I think a lot of people like to hear. The most serious consequence is the emergence of thoughtless, compulsive, and ultimately pathological consumption behaviors, all based on the mechanisms of psychological activation, which is the cause of serious economic, patrimonial, and affective repercussions. Yeah. Holy shit, that is a damn good paragraph.
Yeah, there's a little bit of stuff removed from this middle of that where it's just kind of connective tissue and stuff like that, adding a little bit of things. But it is fundamentally, they're like, no, this is literally bad. We know, we have now seen that there is empirical evidence to suggest that this kind of mechanic in these games do actually result in more gambling and more of these problems, and they in and of themselves result in this stuff. It's very much like I guess they're kind of now pushing towards a little bit of the moral element. Whereas before it was like, hey, is this gambling? And that was moral enough, but now it's like, no, this is literally, this is resulting in all of these awful human behaviors, and we have the evidence that, decent evidence to suggest that it are these, so they are going forward. And I know whenever they first talked about this, it was very much a strong kind of, we're going to be the leaders on this. That's why they're the first to do it. They were saying, we here in Spain are going to be the first to tackle this problem because it's affecting our children, it's affecting our people. This is a moral problem. We need to solve it.
Yeah, I have to wonder, obviously, soccer is humongous in Spain.
They probably have a major problem with FIFA, yeah.
I wonder if that is part of it. And that's what it is. It always takes, a country, a group to, take the first step, and then that's almost like the pilot program for the world. I remember seeing some stuff on, I think it was novel approaches to drug addiction in Portugal. Yeah. And it was one of those things where they saw some good results from that, I believe. And then that kind of is something that, for the rest of the world, everyone can take a look at and maybe borrow some of those good ideas. So to do a breakdown of this legislation, the sort of things that it's including, right? So minors are prohibited from accessing/activating RRM, which is the random reward mechanisms. That's big. Now, that does mean then that any entity using RRM has got to enable documentary verification of the identification of participants, which is fairly interesting. On a voluntary basis, this may be supplemented with biometric identification, and all of this must be available to the relevant authority in line with EU regulations on identity verification.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one, I think.
Very similar to what China are doing, where they're like, okay, if you're an adult, do whatever you want within reason, but minors, we have to be protective of them. You're only allowed to play so much a day, and you need to have your identity verified if you want to play more than that. So that's kind of what they're doing here.
This is not cut and dry.
Yeah,
especially as it is applied in China.
Yeah,
I take humongous issue with the time-based stuff, because ultimately, that's like, in my view, the job of parents.
Of course.
Then it's quite tricky because you get into a situation where shitty parents don't bother to understand what's going on with their kids, and then that leads to a societal problem. So then you could say that it's like a sort of an unpriced externality or something. So there is complexity to it. I'll admit, I have an immediate reflex to that.
Same.
It's like, hey, fucking here's your papers. I don't particularly like that. I kind of don't like the idea of these companies having access to that data. I would worry about their security.
Rightfully so.
I would worry, like, what happens if there's a data breach? I mean, data breaches are super common across the world.
Everyone's been breached, basically.
Yeah. Like, so I am totally down with the idea of, as they put it, RRM not being a thing that kids are accessing.
Yeah.
I just think the implementation of anything there has got to be very, very carefully done.
Yeah, it's like you can't really take a technological approach to stopping minors from doing stuff that they aren't allowed to, because basically, when in history has that ever worked? Everyone knows, you can't, here in the UK and most places, you can't drink alcohol till you're 18. The amount of people who haven't drank alcohol, at least possibly in problematic forms, before 18 is extremely low. It's the same with the whole like porn ban stuff that the UK is tried to do and failed tremendously. Where it's like, yeah, that's not just going to work. You need to have like a social and educational kind of, I guess, answer to the children and minors problem specifically. But just honestly, it's like, maybe the way to stop minors from engaging in this is to ban it entirely, maybe.
To be honest, I actually do kind of... I'm almost closer to that.
Yeah, same.
And I think that there needs to be a very broad educational approach to this.
Yeah.
A good example, most of the teachers teaching in our schools are not aware of really any of this shit massively, right?
Yeah.
They are not going to be... they're not going to be as aware of like a lot of the psychological stuff that causes the compulsive behavior. Because while we're talking about all of these sort of psychological things in the context of, as Spain puts it, RRM, it's also true in TikTok. Like, sure. I'm happy to be the curmudgeon saying TikTok's rotting people's brains, and someone's going to, and Twitter is as well, and someone's going to come in and say, but they said that about the printing press, they said that about your comic books and your television and your radio. But to be honest, I think there's something that's different now, because comic books didn't have, like, the algorithm of comic books was, do I like this story? Do I like this character? Okay. Yeah. Now, there is an extremely sophisticated algorithm that is able to completely overpower people's own decision-making capabilities.
Yeah, the difference is not the reliance on the rational self, but the reliance on the subconscious self and the irrational self and the unconscious self. A lot of it is because the psychological playbook has been opened, because we've studied that. And it is fundamentally the case of like, yeah, all of that stuff turned out to be wrong, but this time they're actually onto something, but they can't quite articulate why. But now we're starting to learn that it is because of those things.
Your whole newspaper or your whole comic book is dynamically generated based on what will be the most psychologically engaging to you in the time frame of 30 seconds. So we're not optimizing for kind of like a long session time in one thing. We're optimizing for...
Yeah.
And that's the difference. So that's not what's talked about. And this is what, totally is here with all of, what is outlined in that paragraph. Now, also, they say parental controls must be available, which make it possible to completely exclude the purchase/use of RRM on any device. In some cases, that kind of thing does exist. Again, there's just an issue there of education and people actually doing it. Also, RRM cannot be marketed as addictive or mislead customers on whether they can improve their odds by spending more. I wonder what that means for a pity system.
Very interesting, actually, because you imagine a pity system would be like a kind of counter to this.
Oh no, a pity system is a nice safety blanket that makes it feel like a more safe activity.
Yeah.
What if you knew that your 200th run of Ice Crown Citadel would guaranteed drop Invincible, the mount in World of Warcraft? Well, in that case, people would farm it more because there's a pity system built in, and if they get it earlier, happy days.
Yeah.
Because they view it as an investment. Yeah. And in the world of gacha, you always see the word invest be used by whales.
Absolutely.
Marketing. Featuring products that contain RRM and broadcast networks can only appear between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. and may only be promoted in online settings that are specifically focused on gambling/RRMs or are being discussed in such terms. Basically, it's just get this shit away from the kids.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing, certainly, if you travel to the USA, maybe you're from here, or for a country that maybe has a little bit more regulation on the sorts of advertising that can be showed, and it's kind of ghastly.
Yeah, I remember I think it was like two specific events kind of hit me at once where around the same time, where one, I saw US advertising for medicine and I was like, holy shit, this is brutal.
Like per
all
our
this
stats,
kind of crazy stuff,
about 42% of you watching right now are from the USA. All I can say is you've got to believe, I would say for a high 90% of people who are not in your country, that's like insane, crazy shit to see.
Yeah, and then the same thing happened to me when I looked at some football in the UK, and I was just like, there's a gambling site, there's a gambling site, there's a gambling site, there's a gambling site. That's not the case anymore with front of shirt sponsors. This was a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
But I was still just like, all of these are gambling. Literally all of these are gambling. And obviously, you see kids running around with those shirts on, with those gambling sites. You're like,
very bizarre.
Is this, what world am I living in? This doesn't quite seem right. Why is no one else looking at this and going, what the fuck is going on? I guess now we did, but it took a long time.
Ultimately, it's a very strange thing between, I suppose, freedom and consequences. And that's always what it's going to be. Because if you could snap your finger and gambling doesn't exist and smoking doesn't exist and people didn't care because they, imagine that there's a fucking, by the way, I never advocate for this because it's deeply wrong. But if you were to just, click your fingers, nobody knows that they've lost those things and they no longer exist. Okay, so we have a society without smoking and gambling. Cool, right, so let's see. The cost of our healthcare system is lower. There's less problem oh, right, everything's literally better.
Yeah, but I think the way I think that most people look at it is that a world where you're not allowed to do bad things, even if you want to, is a dystopia.
Oh, exactly, yeah.
But the utopia version of that is where you feel happy and fulfilled enough you never want to do those things that are bad and harmful or dangerous, or can engage with them in a substantially healthy way or every now and again.
It's like the Star Trek thing where, okay, what is your currency? Well, maybe it's like energy credits because the replicator does take some energy, so I guess there's that. But other than that, your currency is your reputation because people have left behind money because they don't need it anymore because they have replicators. So it's that funny thing of like, I'm not saying, dystopia what we have now so that these things don't exist. Yeah. I'd more say, what would our society look like if it evolved in such a way where those things weren't just weren't there?
And that would require...
And you were to do an A/B test of that.
Yeah, and I think for that to happen, it would require substantial psychological education from a very young age so you understand yourself. You understand all of the decision-making driving you.
Getting the psychologists in the classroom.
Yep, absolutely.
Put it this way. What if we had a games industry where monetized loot boxes were never a thing?
Yeah. What?
Right? Just, the what if, while not realistic, can at least be useful to think about.
Yep.
Now also, they're in Spain talking about the implementation of self-exclusion mechanics Users have to be prompted to set up their own agreed session limit / spending limit on just any product featuring these mechanics, and it will not allow access without those being established. Anytime you watch terrestrial TV here in the UK, you see the gambling ads, and it's very bizarre because they're not, like, they are gambling ads, obviously. Almost all the time they're focusing on spending limits.
Yep.
Which, I mean, obviously they're just doing that so they can continue to get away with it. It's not like it solved the problem, but interesting to think about.
Yep.
In addition then, when a new session is started after an agreed time period is expired, health warnings on RRM must be presented. Eric, you just have Dr. K pop up and say, "Your executive function is being eroded, dear gamer. Please stop."
That would work. That'd work. Or please note, by opening Genshin Impact, your bank account is at risk. Something like that, maybe.
Because, of course, the warnings on the packets of cigarettes, of course, work, don't they? Mm-hmm. Now, what happens if the law is broken? Well, in the worst case, infractions classified as very serious. There'll be sanctions by the Gambling Regulation Authority with a fine between €200,000 and €3 million. This is draft legislation, and funny enough, there has been pushback from Spanish game industry bodies. What a surprise! Who have said that the efficiency of customer protection systems in which the industry has already worked hard on, and it can be deepened through self-regulation or protection regulation of consumers and users, more appropriate approaches than including loot boxes and the regulation of gambling.
Here's a little thought experiment, right?
Motherfuckers haven't self-regulated well at all.
Yeah, here's a thought experiment, I guess, in a way. You know the way there's no loot boxes in Overwatch 2? Is that self-regulation? Or is that because they wouldn't be allowed to actually ship that game in a couple of countries? And now they wouldn't be able to ship the game. Say, Spain next year, the game has to be pulled because there's loot boxes in it. Do you think they did that with their own decision? Or do you think it was everything else?
Or even just the soft power approach.
Yeah.
Where they know that people will get very angry, and the difference between this and Diablo Immortal is the sorts of people who make noise about it online actually matter to that game.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, there's Spain. We'll have to see where it goes. Next, we move to the Netherlands, where it actually does start with a loss. A loss for, I would say, the sort of cause that most of us would be in favor of, but it's a loss that has led to perhaps what could be a more permanent victory.
Yeah, I love the idea of, you push a little bit, get pushed back, and then I guess we hit a sore spot. Let's push really, really hard next time.
So where it all ended up was basically, EA, you can't do this shit. You'll have a €500,000 a week fine split between yourselves and your European subsidiary, up to €10 million, or you could just disable loot boxes in the region. In March of this year, that was overturned. Right? Basically, the Dutch Administrative Jurisdiction Division of the Council of State found that the Dutch Gaming Authority just did not have the right to actually determine whether or not the loot boxes were gambling. So kind of the foundations ended up being more shaky, and that caused it to fall apart a little bit. So the fines reverted, EA can just operate, whatever. But now what's happened is actually pretty good. So in light of this, 6 political parties have made a request to basically introduce specific legislation to target this issue. Right, so I'll go, right? The Room heard the deliberation, noting that in video games, children are manipulated into microtransactions, and so-called loot boxes also involve a form of gambling, noting these transactions are addictive and can burden families with unexpected bills for these transactions with disruptive consequences, noting that consumer associations from 18 European countries are jointly asking for the regulation of these loot boxes. They, of course, note that these are prohibited in Belgium. They call on the government to basically look to ban these in games in the Netherlands, and to amend the law for this where necessary. Now, if this was just 6 completely minor parties with no seats, it wouldn't really matter. But actually, no. So Reset Era user Pokelane took a look at this, and turns out these 6 political parties collectively make up 94 out of 150 seats in the House of Representatives.
That's a majority, yes.
Majority. And 44 out of 75 in the Senate. Also a majority. And that is including a spread across the current government coalition, and also opposition parties.
Yeah,
so basically, there's like a majority, and it is a bipartisan one.
Yeah.
So it's not. I mean, it's government and opposition, right? So that could be kind of awesome. Now, unlike with Spain, it's not like they've defined terms or anything, but evidently, a lot of elected officials want to actually do something about this.
Yeah, and I think that's the fun part. You can see whenever legislation's being pushed and governments don't really want to do it, and they're kind of dragging their feet. And then you see whenever they do, and it's like within a couple of weeks it's done. Kind of in the same way Spain only announced that they were going to push this through a couple of weeks ago. And now they're like, here's a legislation drawn up for public consideration, then we'll fire it through. And the best part is as soon as there's almost like a template out in the wild for what you should do, then everyone else can just go, can we get a Spanish to Dutch translator in? Give us a Dutch version of that document, we'll fire it through, job's done.
Yeah.
And that's the stuff that, especially when they're all within Europe, they'll be like happier to kind of do it. And that's what I think is, I can't believe I ever thought I'd be excited about government regulation, but here we are.
Surprising times. Now, it's time to move to the Anglosphere.
Oh, yes. Oh, dear.
By which I mean the United Kingdom, the United States. Okay, so the UK position is basically just that the Gambling Commission did not find loot boxes to be illegal under the current definition or their purview for regulation, and that basically, hey, Parliament, that's your job. Now, the UK government has been gathering feedback, doing a bunch of stuff for a white paper, which they intend to publish within the next year.
Yeah, so I think the best way
basically.
Yeah, the best way I think to read that is the gambling, I guess, legislation was a gun they could shoot loot boxes with, but they found out that that's not going to work. So they have to find a different gun, they have to build a different gun. But I think they are actually aiming to build the gun.
Yeah, it's just the way things are with the letter of the law, right? Yeah, you kind of do have to go, I suppose, by the letter. Now, in the US, what's interesting is the Norwegian Consumer Council report that we talked about on the channel back in June. That's actually stirred 15 of the US's own advocacy groups into action. They've been writing an open letter to the Federal Trade Commission on the 2nd of June, asking for a specific investigation into EA and Ultimate Team. And again, we need to continue reinforcing to you guys, Ultimate Team is, I don't know if you remember the number, Matt, but Ultimate Team alone is a humongous percentage of Electronic Arts' revenue.
I want to say 78%. Let me just... sorry, yeah, it was 29% of its business in 2021. From one
thing. From the multiplayer of FIFA.
Yeah. The number I was thinking was all of their in-game revenue was 78% or something like that there. But yeah, no, 29%. That was 2021, yeah. 29%. So 30% of their business disappears if FIFA Ultimate Team disappears. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So basically they are, they're essentially just echoing what the Norwegian report says and asking the FTC to really just go into EA, alleging that they are breaching Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act that prohibits unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce.
And yet they are. It's really, really hard to look at this and not just say, well, they clearly are.
Yeah.
Clearly are.
Yeah, so who knows how that will go. Certainly, I forget who it is, whoever's heading up the FTC, I believe. They're basically just a bit more hawkish on big tech.
Yeah, Lena Khan, was it?
Yeah, I think being a bit more hawkish in big tech is kind of more of a thing. But even within that, there are some very interesting things, because regulation can actually be in the favor of incumbents. Yeah. You know, a lot of people think, Jeff Bezos is pushing for a $15 an hour minimum wage because Jeff he can afford it and he wants the right thing for the workers. Well, if Jeff does that, that's fine for him because he's fucking Amazon. I know he's not the CEO anymore, but Amazon can afford that. Whereas their competitors may not be able to afford that. So there is the other side of this where government regulation can be used to further monopolization of a market. So with all of these things, you know, it's not black and white. Everything is gray. It's not like the right is always right, the left is always right. It's all just a big old mix.
Yeah.
So, because it's kind of that thing, like you talk about maybe a more limited specific regulation about one thing, and then people are like, oh, so you're pro-regulation? It's like, nope, not what I said.
No.
So, you know, we have to take these things with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting thing to say about it being supported for incumbents, because if you think about what happens to FIFA Ultimate Team whenever, so what happens to FIFA and EA when Ultimate Team goes away? Well, my first thought was, well, then they might have to make some bloody games to make some money. And that's a thing of like, okay, well, that sounds like, okay, well, finally do your job. And that'll piss them off because they don't get to make as much money for effectively free.
Yeah, they're not in the business of making games.
Yeah.
They're in the business of creating a gambling economy in a game platform that they've made.
Yeah. However, EA are also in the business of making games a decent amount.
Yeah, Fallen Order.
Yeah. And, Apex isn't.
Yeah.
I mean, it does have loot boxes, but like, I'm assuming if they went to a pure cosmetic market, it wouldn't be too damaging because that game's got a relatively low spend per user, as far as I understand.
And it's not player power loot boxes like FIFA.
Yeah, so it's like that's going to be a kind of better thing. But EA are in a great position to make good video games because they have really good developers. So if everyone else who can use the cheap and dirty way to make money go and piss off, then that leaves EA with, technically speaking, a larger share of the video game, I guess, spare revenue pie. Because
Workforce even?
Yeah, workforce as well, where they're the ones who have the developers who can make the money. It's a kind of case of they would probably, like, I mean, there you go, right? All of, say, the likes of Archer, say the likes of those shitty mobile games that just suck money out of people and aren't very good, they all go away. They're all less fun to play because the psychological hooks aren't there. What have you got left? Go play Apex Legends mobile because it's fun. And that means they, theoretically speaking, will have a larger portion of the pie. So will anyone who actually bothers to make games that are engaging in the old way or in the fun or in the meaningful way as opposed to the bing bing wahoo way.
Now it's time to talk about Ted Cruz. This is all quite funny because basically some Asmongold stuff came up on Ted Cruz's podcast. We live in bizarre times.
Ted Cruz is a podcast.
So Ted Cruz discussed his own gaming habits.
Oh dear.
Now, I'm something of a gamer, said Mr. Cruz. I'm not a gamer like hardcore Twitch streamers, and I don't do the massively multiplayer games, Cruz said. I'll tell you, I don't like it when you can buy in-game items and sort of make your character stronger or get advantages. There you go. Old honest Ted doesn't like it.
He does not support pay to win. However,
now I'll confess, when I play some games, I'll sometimes buy it because it's more fun in some way. Oh, Ted. Oh, yeah, Ted. In like, some way. You telling me you don't know, big man?
Yeah, it's like...
You really don't know? You haven't worked it out yet, Buster?
How do you not say that out loud and then just go, hang on a second, I think I've cottoned on to something here. That's such a crazy statement.
Your character has a lot more great stuff that would take you 6 months or a year to build up. Now, Ted, what if I told you they made it so that wealthy people like you would swipe?
Yep.
What if I told you that they wanted to start a war between yourself and a sheikh? Mm-hmm. That's the business model, Ted. Then defaulting to the expected position, of course, for him and his party, that, it's not for the government to step in and regulate the industry. So he says with that, there's a fair amount of randomness, so you can get some great stuff or get some lousy stuff. I guess that's the argument. It's gambling. I'm open to having an argument on this, but I approach the issue with a strong libertarian bent. I'd like to not see kids exploited or harmed, but at the same time, I'm not sure the federal government really has a dog in the fight. I think it comes down to a pretty simple thing. Libertarianism meet pragmatism. How do we how do we mash these things together so that how much do you give up in the way of how much do you give up in the way of efficiency or whatever? Like, do you look at how much type 2 diabetes and obesity costs your healthcare system and then think about, okay, how does this work with the food industry? Then you're like, what do you do?
Yeah, well, what do you do? Yeah, isn't that the whole point of like having, even in the libertarian idea of like having like a government or a community or kind of even a community council of a sort? You kind of go, okay, we'll all be as libertarian as possible, but we do need to have rules of engagement. Because without rules of engagement, then things go very, very wrong very, very quick. People start fucking nuking each other. So you can't really have that going on. The equivalent of that. So you have to have rules that we kind of operate in. They can be loose rules, but they still have to be rules, and they can be decided in like a front. But
Yeah, like libertarians aren't like, big anarchists or something. They do actually generally believe in a government.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, it doesn't have to be full ANCAP all day long. Like, you can have, okay, maybe we shouldn't really be going and making 90% of food full of high fructose corn syrup, and we shouldn't maybe have all advertising point towards...
Matt, just a little sidebar. Big corn. Subsidies. Yum, yum.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the thing of, like, it's the kind of thing there where maybe someone should go, hang on, what's going on here? And it should happen in loot boxes, happening in gambling. Was like, listen, EA, listen, games companies, you've clearly stepped out of the line of what is reasonable. Obviously, that line's very hard to define, but we should be defining it and pulling it back when it's apparent.
Well, I suppose I mean, obviously this is not from an American perspective, but I imagine you guys don't really let kids gamble. And I imagine you guys don't, want to let kids do online gambling. Right? Now, that may just be because the in-person gambling industry is really good at lobbying, and that's why online gambling, I believe, is actually decently regulated in the States.
I believe that's right.
So, you might think that's a nice thing, that they want online gambling for good reasons. I don't know. It's probably just fucking lobbying, dude. But if you're going to say that, like what Ted says here, I guess that's the argument. It's gambling. He's open to having an argument. I mean, that's good. But he approaches it with a strong libertarian bent. In that case, it's like, and I literally don't know this. I try, in fact, to see as little of the US's non-good media output as is possible.
Yep.
There's quite enough going on in the world already. What does Cruz think about online gambling? What does Cruz think about in-person gambling? And if he's going to say that this is kind of like gambling-ish stuff, what's the difference to him?
Yeah.
A funny thing, though, he did end the interview talking about how much he really likes the film Ready Player One, and he's seen it multiple times. It's got nothing to do, of course, with his feelings on loot boxes, but it's just a bit weird.
Yeah, so what we've learned is loot boxes will hopefully die in Europe and the US. The entire gig could hopefully be up. Hopefully this pushes forward and kind of saves gaming from itself in that way, where it will just eat itself alive in order to make the most money. And also, Ted Cruz likes Ready Player One and is a gamer and is a whaling gamer who... How do you like Ready Player One enough to watch it multiple times?
But how do you like Ready Player One as a, big... I mean, how do you look at Ready Player One and think, cool, that's good? Again, I forget. I think it was some writer within the games industry said something about, some sci-fi author could make a book called Don't Open the Box of Infinite Pain, Horror, and Torture, and then some fucking Zuckerberg type would just be like, I've made the box of infinite pain and torture. Look at this cool new product.
Yes, I know exactly what you're referring to. You're referring to a tweet from Alex Blackman, sci-fi author. In my book, I invented the Torment Nexus as a cautionary tale. Tech company, at long last, we have created the Torment Nexus from classic sci-fi novel. Don't create the Torment Nexus. So we're in the midst of creating the Torment Nexuses, or Nexi, I guess. And Ted Cruz is going, hey, the Torment Nexus, that's really cool.
And I fucking love, because I was listening to the Tim Ferriss podcast a while ago, which, I mean, look, he does get really good guests. He's an interesting guy. He's, thought of a lot of good shit. But certainly you can see the, the way sometimes, maybe this has happened, I think people can maybe see this with maybe a Seth Rogen type, where people, maybe they just have so much money and success that perhaps they are not seeing things. With a more easily relatable perspective or something. It's even with Ted, it's very, very easy to be a libertarian when you're wealthy. Straight up. That's easy mode.
So I actually have
because you can maximally utilize your assets to get what you want.
Yeah, I actually have a very interesting... I don't have to source this because it was literally just on Twitter a while ago, but there was a BBC article today that I think it said it was 60% of people who earn 80 to 100k a year in the UK believe they earn about the average. Which obviously anyone looks at statistics and goes, have you lost your fucking marbles?
That's double the average.
Yeah, that's there was because I just googled it to try and find. There was a question. It's like, does 80,000 put you in the top 5% of earners? It's like, no, it doesn't. But it's like a question. It's like, what, how do you think you're average earning? And I guess that's just a thing of what you were saying there. But like level of success, you kind of lose what it's like to be below yourself in the capacity, something like that.
Yeah, like you kind of judge yourself by the average of your peers, right? And like, I say this totally like in my soul, there is a strong like libertarian bent. It's just you see, maybe you see the world and I guess as always happens, things just get more nuanced and complex. And yeah, I don't know. I guess it's like just seeing, Tim Ferriss on the Zuck talk about Ready Player One as if it is like this incredible future where, people are going to be, I'm a fashion designer in the metaverse. And it's like, look, some artist can make a real dope t-shirt that you can wear in VR chat. Cool. Sweet. Yep. But it's the way that you guys talk about this in some fucking crazy, spooky, monolithic thing. And then we find out Meta wants to take a 45% cut. And then I guess you see that, and then you see, old Ted here talking about Ready Player One, seeing him multiple times, really likes the movie. I mean, look, maybe he just said that because he wanted to, get in with the gamers, and maybe just thought, the gamers, they must like Ready Player One. It has games in it. Maybe that's what he thought. Maybe. And maybe he does not, in fact, want to unleash the Torment Nexus from the hit sci-fi novel, Do Not Unleash the Torment Nexus.
Dear God.
Anyway, one Torment Nexus that lots of the world is now properly looking at is that of RRM, as the Spaniards have decided to coin it. Yeah. So, good on you, Spain. Let's see how this develops. And yeah, just fuck off Ultimate Team. Yeah, you horrible evil thing, Diablo Immortal, and all this bullshit.
And to any game developers watching, don't create the Torment Nexus.
Yeah, don't. The guy who makes Citizen Sleeper, which is one of the other games from our publisher, Fellow Travelers, I don't know. I feel like I want him to make the Torment Nexus now. Yeah. I want him to make the game. Anyway, right, that's it from us. Have a great day, everybody. Perhaps we can have some early victories here, so I think we can feel pretty happy about that. I think a pretty sweet situation. So yeah, have a good one. Hope he kept you entertained for about 35 minutes, and see you next time.
Sleep peacefully while video games get better.